A few years ago, a clip from an old TV show went viral online. It showed the opening of the Cologne Carnival in 1973. It was like a German version of a festive variety show. The cream of West German society sitting at tables, with famous performers on stage. The evening was hosted by one of the country's leading MCs, and he decided to liven up the audience right away, and at the same time test them. Roughly speaking, he said, "Slow and steady." Like in the saying, slow and steady wins the race. And you would reply, wins the race. Now guess in 3 tries what came to Germans' minds in 1973 when they heard that familiar exclamation. Cologne's elite gave a Nazi salute live on national television. The host responded with exaggerated indignation. "Come on, people, that can't be. Look how many old comrades we have with." And yet there was plenty to be surprised about. It was November 1973. Nearly 30 years had passed since the war. An entire generation had grown up without witnessing its horrors firsthand, longing at last to free itself from the traumas of the past. Just a couple of months before this event, both German states, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, had been admitted to the United Nations. In other words, both West and East Germans had been formally forgiven and welcomed back into the club of civilized nations. What makes it even more striking is that the Chancellor of West Germany at the time was Willy Brandt, one of the most left-leaning leaders in Germany's history. 3 years earlier, during a visit to Poland, he had spontaneously knelt before the monument to the heroes of the Warsaw Uprising, breaking all diplomatic protocol. With that gesture, Brandt honored the memory of millions and silently repented on behalf of the entire nation. He personally had nothing to apologize for. He had been fighting Nazism since the 1930s. Brandt asked forgiveness in the name of all Germans, and for this policy of reconciliation, he would later be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 25 years after the fall of the Third Reich, the country had officially repented for the crimes of Nazism. But why did it take so long? And the main question raised by that televised incident is even sharper. Did the country truly repent at all? There's a well-known saying in certain circles, "The Third Reich is dead, but its leadership is missing." From there, countless theories emerge about a submarine that carried Adolf Hitler to Argentina, or secret Nazi bases on the moon. Like most conspiracy theories, these stories are built on fragments of reality. In this video, you'll learn what happened to the millions of former Nazis after the collapse of the Nazi Party, how denazification was organized within the country, and why it both largely failed and, paradoxically, helped save the state. We will step inside the mind of an ordinary Nazi hiding in the Argentine wilderness and find out who helped him escape to South America. We'll examine the structure of the secret ODESSA network and explore how Germany tried to overcome the legacy of the Third Reich's dictatorship. Why did former Nazis end up in leadership positions in both West and East Germany after the war? And most importantly, how did millions of people, including outright executioners, manage to evade punishment for their crimes? Today is March 24th, 1945. Stierlitz is on his way back to Berlin. In just 45 days, the Great Patriotic War will be over, though no one knows that yet. Colonel Isaev is returning to the heart of the collapsing Reich to continue his mission. The legendary Soviet TV series, 17 Moments of Spring, ends almost mid-sentence. Its 3-minute epilogue briefly shows the victory parade and the fate of the top Nazi leaders. And that's where the story stops. But how exactly did the Third Reich unravel and fall apart? And what would have happened to Stierlitz himself? Yulian Semyonov, the author of 17 Moments, addressed these questions later in his lesser-known yet significant novels, Ordered to Survive and Expansion. We'll return to those books as our story unfolds. For now, Let's turn the calendar back 12 years to March 24th, 1933. On that day, President Paul von Hindenburg signed a law passed by Parliament granting extraordinary powers to the head of government. That position had recently been taken by the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, a World War I veteran, former informant, ex-prisoner, radical speaker, and master of political spectacle. Having become Reich Chancellor, Hitler immediately began consolidating power. He tightened control, purged state institutions, and cleared the political arena of Jews, communists, and virtually all opposition. To Germany's elites, he framed these measures as necessary for stability and national revival. But once he had strengthened his grip, he sidelined or eliminated many of them as well. Germany, a country that had recently faced bankruptcy and humiliation, was soon pumped full of dangerous economic stimulants. The regime relied on debt instruments that fueled rapid rearmament, promissory notes backed by little more than the Führer's word. As discussed in our previous episode about the massive financial pyramid of the Third Reich, the system was fundamentally unsustainable. And before the bubble could burst, Germany plunged the world into war. At first, the Nazi campaign seemed unstoppable. Vast territories across Europe were seized, supplying the Reich with raw materials, wealth, and forced labor. This wasn't merely a system of slavery. It was an entire machinery of exploitation. Millions suffered under Nazi terror. But Hitler made fatal miscalculations. The failure of the Blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union, followed by the declaration of war on the United States, triggered a chain reaction of strategic disasters. By then, there was no one left willing or able to challenge him. Generals and politicians had been intimidated, purged, bribed, or rendered powerless. From 1943 onward, Germany's territory began shrinking at an accelerating pace. By early 1945, the Red Army advancing from the east and Allied forces from the west had crossed into Germany's pre-war borders. And so we return to the moment where Semyonov left Stierlitz, traveling toward Berlin on Saturday, March 24th, 1945. It's important to note that by 1943, when the Reich had only begun to crack but hadn't yet collapsed, the Nazi leadership already understood the situation. Propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels declared the start of total war across Germany. By the spring of 1945, what had been a propaganda slogan had truly become total. Every sector of life, almost every German, was mobilized. According to even conservative estimates, 3/4 of Germany's GDP and workforce were devoted to the war effort. Before we dive into our turn-based strategy scenario, a bit of context. The story behind 17 Moments of Spring is based on real events. Specifically, the Nazi leadership's secret attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the West. The negotiator on their side was Karl Wolff, Himmler's right-hand man and de facto Reich representative in occupied Italy. His Western counterpart was the future CIA chief, Alan Dulles. Semyonov portrayed these negotiations with remarkable accuracy, even handling dates correctly. But there's one crucial difference between the series and reality. In the show, Wolff negotiates with Himmler's approval behind Hitler's back. In truth, it was exactly the opposite. Hitler knew everything and stayed silent, while Himmler remained unaware. Preparing these negotiations took 2 full years. While Goebbels raged in Berlin, calling for total mobilization, the Red Army was pushing the Wehrmacht out of the Caucasus, and the Allies were finishing off Rommel's forces in Africa. The Nazis were quietly preparing escape routes. Years later, German officer Heinz Felfe revealed many of these details. In our total war strategy, one of the key focuses will be on covering tracks. On March 19th, Hitler issued the infamous Nero Decree. All infrastructure, from bridges to warehouses, was to be destroyed if Germans had to retreat. The order was handed to Minister of Armaments Albert Speer as a gift for his 40th birthday. The Nazi leadership was relatively young by the standards of the time, ambitious, ruthless, and greedy. But for the first time in his life, Speer intentionally defied the Führer's orders. Some bridges over the Rhine were blown up, others spared, but it wasn't enough to stop the Allies from crossing the river and reaching the plains on March 24th. Incidentally, this operation inspired the final mission in one of the Call of Duty games. One more week passes. In early April, Anglo-American forces swept through Western Germany, capturing administrative centers. Local Nazis rushed to destroy documents, evidence, and often themselves. April saw the peak of this wave. In Berlin alone, nearly 4,000 Nazis perished in a month, and roughly the same number across the country. By early April, Himmler attempted a complex maneuver. He contacted the head of the Swedish Red Cross, formally to transfer prisoners under their care, but in reality to reach Western leaders and propose a favorable peace. While Himmler played humanitarian, his subordinates continued destroying evidence and murdering prisoners. By mid-April, mass executions intensified. In one northern town, under SS orders, local youth corralled 1,000 people into a barn and set it ablaze. Meanwhile, the Allies redirected their forces south toward Munich, the cradle of the Nazi movement. The NSDAP headquarters was there, including the party treasurer's office and the central membership files. The Nazis knew they had to act. Next move, destroy the party archives, containing records of 8 million members, about 10% of the country's population, including infants. On April 15th, a man from party headquarters arrived at a paper factory in Munich's suburbs. The owner was gone, but the manager explained, "In a few days, a pile of papers will arrive here that must be destroyed." This moment became pivotal. The manager, who was not a party member and had little sympathy for the Nazis, made a decisive choice. Instead of destroying the archives, he hid them as scrap paper. When Germany surrendered, the manager, Hans Huber, spent 6 months trying to present the archive to the occupying authorities. At first, they ignored him, but eventually realized the treasure he had preserved. Thanks to him, the Nazis could never fully vanish into the shadows. By late April 1945, it was time for another turn, blending into the crowd. The Red Army had begun encircling Berlin, marking the final agony of the Nazi regime. On April 20th, Hitler turned 56. Almost immediately, key ministers fled. SS Chief Himmler moved north to negotiate with the Swedes, offering prisoners in exchange for his own survival. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring moved south, sending a letter claiming authority over the remaining forces. Hitler, shocked, removed Göring from all posts. Himmler suffered the same fate shortly after. By April 30th, the front lines were just 250 meters from Hitler's bunker, coincidentally, the same length as the Titanic. That night, Hitler drafted his final will, splitting the roles of president and chancellor. On the afternoon of April 30th, Hitler was dead. Joseph Goebbels followed the next day, leaving a single letter to Stalin reporting Hitler's death and requesting a ceasefire, which went unanswered. First week of May, the Reich was reduced to scattered, loosely connected territories. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, tried to assert authority and negotiate a final settlement with the Allies. When refused, he ordered German forces to surrender, canceled Hitler's Nero decree, and prepared for capitulation. A tragedy occurred. Ships in port carrying former concentration camp prisoners, intended by Himmler for exchange with Sweden, were sunk by Allied planes, killing 9,000 innocent people, half aboard the liner Cap Arcona. Finally, Germany surrendered. Nazi leaders were either dead or captured. For a short time, there was no leadership, an unprecedented power vacuum. Only on June 5th did the 4 Allied powers, USSR, USA, Britain, and France, formally declare Germany dissolved. Germany had reached 0 hour, left alone to face the consequences of its own regime. According to the film Jojo Rabbit, the characters lived in a small town in central Germany. Outside, it was spring of 1945, so most of the screen time shows them waiting anxiously for the approaching armies. The climax of the movie comes with the street fighting, as both American troops and the Red Army enter the town. Once the dust settled, it became clear that the town was now in the American occupation zone. The filmmakers suggested it was the perfect moment to break out flashy outfits and dance to David Bowie, though of course he hadn't even been born yet. Still, the general mood of Germans in 1945 is depicted accurately. They understood the grim fate that awaited them if captured by the Red Army. They would have to answer for atrocities like Katyn, Babi Yar, and countless other horrific acts. For the Nazis, falling into the hands of the Western Allies seemed a relatively better prospect. There were even tragicomic stories. Werner Naumann, Goebbels' successor as Minister of Propaganda, fled twice. After his boss's death, he successfully escaped the Führer's bunker through Soviet lines, only to discover that the place he settled was in the Soviet zone. He spent a year pretending to be a modest stonemason before finally making it west. Meanwhile, the Allies were deciding how to handle a defeated Germany. Interestingly, the most radical plan for reorganizing the country did not originate in the East, but in the United States. It was proposed by U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, a longtime ally of President Roosevelt. The plan was extreme. Germany would be divided into 3 parts. A small, industrially developed western section would be placed under international control, while the rest of the country would be split into northern and southern zones. Within 6 months of the armistice, all industrial infrastructure would be removed. Factories, machines, anything not transportable, like mines, would be destroyed. The country would be reduced to 2 massive potato fields, incapable of waging war ever again. Essentially, Hitler's idea of turning Aryans into happy farmers would be realized by force. Initially, Roosevelt and Churchill supported Morgenthau's plan, but American and British bureaucrats balked. They feared it would trigger political and economic disaster. When details of the plan leaked in 1944, before Germany had even lost the war, Goebbels used the opportunity to rally the population. "Look what they want to do to us! Everyone to arms!" American officers later joked that Morgenthau's harsh plan inadvertently created 30 new German divisions. Eventually, Roosevelt sidelined Morgenthau, though he managed to push through some ideas on occupation policy that would be used later. By comparison, the Soviet proposals were milder. Industry could be relocated, but heavy industry only. Germany would be divided into occupation zones, but the country would ideally remain intact, to be reintegrated into the civilized world once Germans were ready. These principles largely guided the decisions at Yalta and Potsdam. Germany was to be demilitarized, denazified, and democratized. The country was forbidden from maintaining a military. War industries were dismantled, and democratic institutions were implemented under Allied supervision. Anyone responsible for war crimes was to be punished, but determining legal charges against the Nazi leadership proved tricky. Churchill, for example, had suggested simply executing them, but the Allies wanted a process that was legally rigorous, painful, but a lesson for the entire nation. The solution came from an American lawyer, Murray Bernays, whose wife was the sister of Edward Bernays, the pioneer of modern PR and propaganda. After marrying in 1917, he took his wife's surname, an unusual move at the time, perhaps inspired by his uncle-in-law's mastery of public image. By 1945, Murray Bernays was a colonel in the U.S. Army with substantial legal experience. He proposed treating work for Hitler's regime as participation in a conspiracy to commit war crimes. In other words, Nazis were judged like influential mobsters, difficult to imprison, using only written orders or documents. The cutoff point was 1933, when the NSDAP came to power. The principle applied was one of presumed guilt. We know you are an enemy and a killer. Now try to prove you are not. This legal approach became the foundation of the Nuremberg Trials, a historic event. Yet the tribunal was only one part of a larger plan for post-war justice. When the Nuremberg Trials finally began in the fall of 1945, denazification was already in full swing across Germany. However, it proceeded very differently in each occupation zone. Formally, ultimate authority rested with the Allied Control Council, which set broad rules, regulated borders, and oversaw laws. In practice, though, it functioned as a condominium, joint control by the four victorious powers. The situation in post-war Germany resembled modern-day Antarctica, one large territory, but effectively managed by multiple external actors. By early August, the boundaries of the occupation zones were finally established, and a general framework was formalized at Potsdam. The famous 3 Ds: democratization, demilitarization, and denazification. After that, each occupying power pursued its own approach. Starting with the simplest, France. Their overriding priority was security, primarily protecting France from yet another large-scale conflict with Germany, potentially the fourth in just a century. Paris strongly opposed the idea of a unified Germany that might recover and retaliate. Their strategy was a mix of divide and rule and gentle containment, aiming to carve out pieces of Germany to serve as buffer states, reminiscent of the pre-Bismarck era with its patchwork of principalities. Denazification in the French zone was carried out lightly. It wasn't a major focus. As a result, their sector became something of a safe haven for former Nazis. Werner Naumann, the ex-propaganda minister, resurfaced there after his escape. The British, on the other hand, prioritized rebuilding Germany's economy. First, they wanted to signal that the victors were not going to starve anyone, a subtle encouragement to the Germans to reflect on their actions. Second, Britain itself was still on rationing. They didn't want to feed Germany and risk burdening themselves. Experienced industrialists were largely left alone. If your surname wasn't Krupp or Flick, you were probably safe. In the Soviet zone, a completely different logic prevailed: socialist logic. Factories and private lands were immediately nationalized. The reasoning was simple. Nazism was a creation of capitalists and landowners. By targeting them, the Soviets could undermine the foundations of German militarism. Former Nazi elites were placed in displaced persons camps. Roughly 200,000 passed through this process, the same number as in the other 3 zones combined. Captured Germans were also sent to the USSR to rebuild what they had destroyed, adding to those already in labor camps. In many large Soviet cities, districts still stand that were built by these German prisoners, neighborhoods like the cozy blocks near Pervomaiskaya Metro and Oktyabrskoye Pole in Moscow. The most systematic denazification was carried out by the Americans. Unlike the British, they did not rush to restore the German economy. Eisenhower himself secretly hoped to keep Germany as a potato field, limiting its potential for future militarism. Unlike the French, the Americans targeted broad layers of society, not just top Nazis. They introduced questionnaires, organized visits to concentration camps, and ranked citizens by their degree of culpability. Even Eisenhower admitted in October 1945 that denazifying piece by piece would take 50 years. By the following year, it was already clear the process was stalling. Tensions between the Allies were growing. Less than a year after the war ended, Churchill delivered his famous speech in Fulton, a moment historians often mark as the start of the Cold War. Relations between the powers were fraying. The US and Britain criticized Stalin for his treatment of Germans, while Moscow accused France of trying to annex the Saar region near Luxembourg. Meanwhile, new hotspots were emerging worldwide. That the Allies could even conduct a joint tribunal for the Nazi leadership was a major achievement. The Nuremberg Trials lasted exactly 1 year, from fall 1945 to fall 1946, and the further proceedings went, the more conflicts arose among prosecutors from different countries. Western prosecutors focused on the fine details of Ribbentrop's package deals, while the Soviets questioned Germany's industrial military links and the fate of hundreds of thousands of civilians killed by Allied bombing. On October 1, 1946, the court delivered its verdict. 12 were sentenced to death, 7 to prison, and 3 were acquitted, including Reichsbank head Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of Germany's financial pyramid that had fueled the war. 2 weeks later, the death sentences were carried out, though only 10 of the top Nazi leaders were executed. Hermann Göring resolved his fate himself, while Bormann was officially listed as missing. After Hitler's defeat, the Allies planned a series of trials for Nazi doctors, bureaucrats, and businessmen. But instead of proceeding, they temporarily dispersed. These sectoral trials eventually took place, but only in the American occupation zone, under American law, resulting in far lighter sentences. Consider the numbers. Across 12 trials, 178 individuals were prosecuted. Compared to Nuremberg, the death penalty rate dropped from over 50% to 14%, and in practice, even fewer were executed. Across all trials of the Nazi elite, charges were brought against only 200 individuals, roughly 1 in every 4,000 Germans. A chance as unlikely as being struck by lightning. Of those executed, the odds were even lower, comparable to a shark attack. But what about the millions who carried out the criminal policies of the NSDAP leadership? And here we arrive at the central question of this episode. How did they evade justice? This chapter is perfectly captured by the main advertising slogan of Persil laundry detergent. Let the memories remain, not the stains. And no, this isn't an ad placement. This was precisely what ordinary Germans sought after the war, the so-called Persil ticket. It was a certificate that confirmed you were clean, free of the dried red and brown stains of Nazism. It meant you had successfully undergone denazification. To obtain this certificate, one first had to complete a detailed questionnaire and then find 2 witnesses to confirm your credibility. Unsurprisingly, ordinary Nazis often thought 3 steps ahead and provided glowing references for each other. Imagine you were a minor cog in the regime, say, a secretary in a deputy ministry of transportation, the Reichsverkehrsministerium. Perhaps you had no blood on your hands directly, but your work contributed to crimes against humanity. You might have been involved in organizing the logistics for trains carrying people to death camps. Want to avoid punishment? Option 0. The simplest path, like Kurt Bain or a dishonored samurai. You simply die before your trial. There's an old, slightly crude joke. The swastika represents 4 Gs: Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Göring. The top leaders of the Reich escaped punishment because they preempted the trial and the gallows. Some fell in battle, like Martin Bormann, de facto NSDAP, Secretary General, who fled the Hitler bunker with propaganda minister Werner Naumann. The group split, and the half with Bormann disappeared. Rumors claimed he was seen in Paraguay, Chile, and Bolivia. Only in the 1970s were his remains discovered near Berlin Hauptbahnhof. Another way to escape punishment was to die in custody. SS officer Oskar Dirlewanger, infamous even among his peers, commanded a division of criminals and maniacs that terrorized civilians on the Eastern Front. Beaten and ultimately killed by Polish soldiers in France, who remembered his role in crushing the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, he met his end before any tribunal. But for most Nazis, survival was the primary goal. Option 1. Confess, admit some involvement, but embellish or minimize details. For example, yes, I was responsible for laying railroad tracks. But what ran on those tracks? Where were they going? No idea. I had no such information. This approach worked. Albert Speer, the Reich's chief architect of armaments, convinced the tribunal that he had no knowledge of the Holocaust, claiming he only acted within his capacity and used forced labor because of the circumstances. He received a 20-year sentence, though a noose for Hitler's favorite hung over his head. Speer served his term, gave interviews, presented himself as a conscientious official, and died of a stroke while meeting a mistress in a London hotel. For ordinary Nazis, however, the stakes were lower and chances higher. Fill out the questionnaire correctly, bring 2 witnesses, and you could receive the desired classification. The Americans implemented this system most systematically. Their 131-question Fragebogen questionnaire covered everything. Which Nazi organizations you belonged to, attendance at party rallies, informing on neighbors, donations to the party fund. Everything counted. The last question was a trap. The Americans tried to export the system to other occupation zones. The British and French used it half-heartedly, and in the Soviet zone, there was a completely different questionnaire. There was no centralized process to purge Germany of Nazism. After completing the questionnaire, individuals were assigned one of 5 categories based on their involvement with the regime. Let's start from the top, or rather, the bottom. Category 5. Uninvolved. People who lived through the Hitler years without participating in crimes, sometimes even aiding victims. Anti-fascists, priests, ordinary citizens not in the party. In the American zone, 75% of the population, over 9 million people, fell into this category. The remaining 4 categories covered varying levels of involvement: sympathizers, minor participants, mid-level officials who profited from the war, and top leadership, the party elite and SS leaders. In this pyramid-like hierarchy, most ordinary people were classified as sympathizers. Over 10 million people across all occupation zones fell into this broad category. However, the system wasn't perfect. Individuals with widely differing levels of guilt could end up in the same category, depending on how honestly they filled out the form and whom they brought as witnesses. 2 examples. Wilhelm Stuckart, Deputy Minister of the Interior, drafted anti-Semitic racial laws and organized parts of the Holocaust. By manipulating the court and using connections, he served 4 years and was released as a sympathizer. Another example, Joseph Swine, a German-French mayor of a small town, forced to join the party in his 60s. He honestly reported his activities post-war and was classified as a sympathizer. His pension was halved, and he was barred from practicing his profession. Keep in mind, this was the mid-20th century. All forms and interviews were conducted manually. No Zoom calls, no online quizzes. Eisenhower was correct when he said full denazification would take 50 years. The NSDAP membership files carefully preserved by the paper mill manager were both a tool and a burden for the Allies. Imagine 8 million party members, plus roughly 45 million adults involved in affiliated organizations, all needing review. And across the 4 zones, the Allies had maybe a few 100,000 officials handling the process. A single person often handled dozens of cases. Youth were largely excluded. Those indoctrinated in school might later improve. The minimum age cutoff was 16, reflecting Nazi adjustments to recruit 16-year-olds to show unity with Hitler. When we look at denazification as a massive project, its scale becomes obvious. Like tackling a huge task with enthusiasm, only to realize the complexity drains your energy and productivity. This is exactly what happened with Allied denazification. Year by year, their sleeves rolled down, Cold War tensions rose, and focus waned. Interestingly, Austria, Hitler's homeland, and the site of the Reich's first political success, is often overlooked. Occupied and divided into 4 zones, Austria initially set up a temporary government and actively pursued former Nazis, 500,000 people. By 1947, however, remaining Austrian Nazis were being released under amnesty, turning the country into a haven for fugitives. This became the second way to evade punishment: simply disappear from the sinking ship. In Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, she describes SS officer Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust. Equally banal and terrifying was Franz Nowak, his assistant from Austria. Nowak managed the logistics of deporting Jews to death camps, a linear manager executing the machinery of genocide. In 1945, he fled to Austria under a false identity and later benefited from amnesty. He was briefly imprisoned for violating transportation rules, serving 5 years, just over 3 minutes per person he sent to death. Already during the years of perestroika, Julian Semyonov explored Stierlitz's adventures after the war. According to the story, on the streets of Berlin, he was accidentally shot by a Soviet soldier, but rescued by a young German partisan. The partisan handed him over to his contacts, who then helped Stierlitz escape via Spain to Latin America through what was called the ODESSA network. This has nothing to do with the port city on the Black Sea. In this context, ODESSA was supposedly a secret organization aiding fleeing Nazis. The name was invented by journalist Frederick Forsyth in his novel, The Odessa File. Here, ODESSA stands for a German abbreviation, an organization of former SS members. The book became a bestseller, and the name Odessa entered popular usage. This is also where our old acquaintance, Naumann, the former propaganda minister, reappears. By the early 1950s, he had quietly legalized his status in West Germany and started reconnecting with his former associates. But not for nostalgia. The son of Goebbels aimed to infiltrate the leadership of the liberal FDP party to influence German politics. British intelligence uncovered the plot, arrested Naumann's circle, and handed them to the FRG authorities. They debated whether to charge them with attempted coup, but ultimately, they simply held them for a few months and released them. Firstly, because evidence was lacking. Secondly, because the reasoning seemed obvious. Everyone knew these people by sight. They had nowhere to run. Naumann's group operated mainly inside Germany, though he certainly had contacts among fugitives, including Hitler's chief saboteur Ottoni, who after the war became an agent for nearly 5 intelligence services. In the press, he was referred to as one of Odessa's leaders. Let's break down how these escape routes worked. Initially, a trickle of fugitives fled along so-called rat lines to northern Europe, mainly Sweden. These were mostly SS personnel who had served in northern Germany, Denmark, Norway, and the Baltic states during the war. But that was just a small stream. The main pipeline ran across the Atlantic to Latin America, facilitated by Catholic priests, not the church institution as a whole, but individual clerics. While the Vatican officially maintained neutrality, certain high-ranking representatives voluntarily helped Nazis evade justice. Why? Several reasons. First, political sympathies. Some priests saw Germans almost as crusaders, fighting godless Bolsheviks. Second, influence. Assisting fugitives allowed them to wield political leverage through these contacts, like a literal godfather relationship. In total, about 10,000 former Nazis fled to Latin America after the war, roughly half of whom were either practicing Catholics or from Catholic regions of Germany. Prominent examples included Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann, the Angel of Death, Josef Mengele, the lion butcher Klaus Barbie, and others. Research has shown a correlation between nominal Catholic faith and support for the Nazi Party in the 1930s. Many were shallow Christians, culturally identifying as Christian but largely ignoring moral precepts, attending church only on holidays, and mostly for appearances. These individuals were more likely to support Nazism than truly devout members. Hitler, upon coming to power, had guaranteed the Catholic Church state recognition, a rare example of consistency from him, creating a reciprocal relationship that facilitated these escape routes. By 1942, even before Germany's collapse, Vatican Secretary of State Luigi Maglione, the de facto prime minister, first approached Argentina to help protect German Catholics who were also Nazis. Argentina itself had remained neutral for most of the war, with its elite split between pro-British officials and pro-German generals. In 1943, a military coup brought a junta to power, and later, General Juan Perón assumed leadership. While not a supporter of racism, he openly admired the Third Reich. After the war, Perón actively facilitated the arrival of skilled Nazi personnel. In recent years, Argentine authorities released documents confirming that officials had known from the outset who and how Nazis were fleeing Germany, covering nearly 2,000 records, including those on Josef Mengele. The escape routes typically bypassed formal refugee procedures. First, fugitives hid from enemies or escaped captivity. Then informal networks connected them to sympathizers like Cardinal Alois Hudal, who provided contacts and assistance for travel to South America. Finally, German expatriate communities helped them integrate locally. For instance, Holocaust architect Eichmann worked briefly at a Mercedes-Benz factory in Argentina before being abducted by Mossad agents and transported to Tel Aviv, a story portrayed in the film Operation Finale. The rat lines were not only for religious protection, they also allowed Nazi scientists and engineers to be absorbed by foreign states. During Operation Paperclip, nearly 800 top German scientists, including rocket engineer Werner von Braun, were taken to the United States, while others went to Arab nations seeking expertise for military programs. Even so, many former Nazis were needed back in Germany. By 1948, Roberto Rossellini's film Germany, Year Zero, depicted the devastation of Berlin and the moral dilemmas of ordinary citizens under post-war conditions, showing a society struggling with trauma and survival. Despite this, many Germans had no interest in fully confronting the past, and denazification ultimately faltered. Teachers, lawyers, and other professionals were gradually reinstated. Millions of low- and mid-level Nazis were eventually pardoned under amnesties, allowing them to reintegrate into post-war West Germany. One such figure was Emil Pohl, former deputy head of the Reichsbank, who managed the handling of gold looted from murdered Jews. He served only 6 months of a 5-year sentence and returned to work in private banking. Other opportunistic Nazis waited until denazification measures softened, then re-emerged to prove their utility to the new state. Lieutenant General Reinhard Gehlen approached U.S. counterintelligence in Bavaria in May 1945 with intelligence on the Soviet Union, trading knowledge for freedom. His team would later become the foundation of West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, operating under CIA supervision. Interestingly, Heinz Felfe, one of Gehlen's collaborators, was simultaneously a KGB agent, and Gehlen himself had protectors not only in the U.S., but also in West Germany. The influential Hans Globke, formerly a government official, but a key figure in both Nazi and post-war Germany, had drafted laws facilitating Hitler's dictatorship and orchestrated deportations of Jews to death camps. Yet Globke avoided prosecution, passing denazification with relative ease and becoming a central figure in the FRG. Under this cover, ex-Nazis like Gehlen built intelligence networks that persist to this day. Now let's talk about what happened with denazification in Germany, particularly in the East. Many Muscovites, or anyone who strolled through the city center, have probably wondered, what is that building in the very heart of Moscow, standing closed for renovations for years on Tverskaya Street, between Ilisievsky and the Moscow bookstore? Here's the story. For the last 100 years, it has been a hotel. In the 1950s, it was called the Central. Before that, Lux. In the 1930s and 40s, it was entirely occupied by German communists who had fled the Reich. Essentially, it served as a second unofficial German embassy in the USSR, or even a kind of government-in-exile headquarters. On April 30th, 1945, just hours before Hitler's death, a small delegation of 10 people departed from the Lux Hotel. They boarded a plane and, with a stopover in Minsk, eventually reached Berlin. These were former leaders of the German Communist Party, tasked with 2 missions. First, to rebuild the leftist movement in Germany. The group was led by Walter Ulbricht, former KPD deputies, and the future longtime leader of East Germany. Remarkably, the Communist Party was re-established in just a month. The second task was to build socialism and rebuild the country. In the Soviet occupation zone, pragmatism soon outweighed ideology and propaganda, similar to the West. Without involving people who had served in the Nazi political system, reconstructing anything was impossible. Emotions toward recent enemies had to be set aside, and German realists were incorporated to maintain influence in the heart of Europe. The GDR offers a clear example of the fourth method for escaping punishment. Even after German reunification, it became known how East German intelligence employed former SS officers. For instance, if one had ties to Protestant communities, he could monitor them. Another, skilled in interrogations, could be assigned that task. Some maintained networks in the West, useful for intelligence or blackmail operations. A cleverer scheme also emerged. Shortly before East Germany was officially founded, the National Democratic Party of Germany, NDPD, appeared in the Soviet zone, a magnet for former Nazis to isolate, register, and integrate them into the new society. In other words, denazification in the Soviet zone had two parallel approaches: removing some Nazis from society while integrating others. It's important to note that anti-fascism was the core ideology of the GDR. Victims of fascism, in the narrow sense, were underground communists persecuted by the Gestapo. Broadly, it included all Germans harmed by the Nazi regime. The GDR's approach mirrored Austria's. We were the first victims. Those in the West who hold power are the heirs. They must repent. It was a mutually beneficial deal. Germans with skeletons in the closet could continue to live and work, while the new government could showcase the GDR as a model state. Building the country required capable Germans, not moon people. The management of the GDR was drawn from three unequal groups: underground communists, hardened by imprisonment and loss of networks, Moscow-based exiles from the Lux Hotel, and experienced bureaucrats with highly specific pasts. For example, take the Ministry of Trade. Older viewers might recall the Soviet film You Wouldn't Even Dream, a Romeo and Juliet-style story set in Brezhnev-era apartment blocks. One of the first teenage meetings occurs in a brand-new department store, Leipzig department store, which was supplied entirely by the Ministry of Trade in East Germany, with scarce, fashionable goods. Over 40 years, the GDR had 7 ministers of trade. The first pre-war minister was a moderate socialist who avoided fighting Hitler, relocated to the countryside, and ran a farm. The second minister was a committed communist, imprisoned for 3 years, occasionally arrested afterward. The third minister joined the NSDAP voluntarily in 1938, fought 6 years at the front, and miraculously survived. His surname, Merkel, pure coincidence. The fourth minister supported Social Democrats, but secretly worked for the Nazi regime, employed in Göring's enterprise in occupied Czechoslovakia. The fifth minister was too young to distinguish himself during the war. The sixth minister, who oversaw the opening of the new Leipzig store, had fought against the USSR, was captured in 1944, and then enrolled in an anti-fascist school in Minsk under Soviet guidance, becoming a technocrat. The seventh minister joined the NSDAP at 16, surrendered a year later, aligned with the NDPD in the Soviet zone, and eventually rose to deputy party leadership. The result was a mix of former Nazis, communists, and Komsomol members, a calculated blend. The strategy was clear: repent, assimilate, and dissolve into society. Those with more suspicious pasts were known only to the careful archivists and historians working with Stasi records, which contained protocols on every official, from uncles with NSDAP pins to youths who had toyed with Hitler youth knives. In the early 2000s, German researchers studied nearly 180,000 files on GDR leadership, officials, and managers. Data from the 1980s revealed that over 5% of the top GDR officials had once been NSDAP members. About 1 in 10 had fathers in the party. In some sectors, like science, the proportion rose to nearly 20%. Researchers even identified 80 former SS officers in the late GDR elite. A notable exception was Wolfgang Biermann, director of Carl Zeiss, the world-leading optical mechanical factory. He refused to hire anyone with a brown past, though he himself had briefly joined the NSDAP in 1944. And what about GDR and FRG youth? How did they live in a world where some remained silent, some did not ask questions, and others wanted revenge against those responsible for the devastation of their country? For them, it was like hitting two targets. For them, it was like hitting two targets at once. Schleyer was both a hardened capitalist and a former Nazi who had downplayed his SS record, earning the status of a fellow traveler and continuing his career unimpeded. Schleyer lived and worked in the French occupation zone, where, as we know, denazification had little real effect. He was far from the RAF's first victim. Most members of this terrorist organization were young people who had lived briefly during the Third Reich but didn't experience it fully. Others, who were smarter and refrained from committing murders and attacks, felt the trauma of the past, but certainly not as intensely as their parents. They simply couldn't understand how people could remain silent, how they could avoid asking questions about themselves and a history that had only recently become history. The dust had not yet settled, despite claims to the contrary. The generational gap between fathers and children in Germany at the time became a chasm. According to social surveys from the late 1960s, 42% of those born during the war or denazification years believed that West Germany was ripe for socio-political change. Among citizens over 50, those born in the Kaiser era, barely 1 in 10 thought the same. 2/3 of the youth were firmly convinced that the country's Nazi past needed to be addressed openly. Among older generations, fewer than 1/3 felt this way, a clear generational divide. The younger generation did not need to compromise, hide, lie, or prove anything. They were born into a ruined country being rebuilt before their eyes, funded by Western loans. Once their basic needs were met, they could focus on politics. Who exactly were the Germans now in charge? What had they been doing in 1944 or in 1935? By the late 1940s, the Allies had grown tired of micromanaging and handed Germany's fate over to the Germans themselves. West German authorities devised a two-pronged approach to deal with the past. On one hand, they issued amnesties to restore normal life for millions. On the other, they introduced a criminal code section targeting unconstitutional organizations and created a special service to monitor compliance. The term unconstitutional was broad enough to serve as a tool against neo-Nazis and suspected sympathizers. The youth of the time had their heroes, especially prosecutor Fritz Bauer, a young socialist lawyer. In the 1930s, he had fled the Nazis to Sweden, where he befriended the future Chancellor Willy Brandt. Returning to Germany after the war, Bauer quickly rose to become the state prosecutor of Hesse. His life's mission became seeking justice, not merely against individual perpetrators, but against the system of fear and silence itself. In the late 1950s, he began preparing a landmark trial against the guards of Auschwitz, not the commandants, but the lower and mid-level executioners. For the first time in Germany, small-scale perpetrators were publicly tried. Imagine the shock for ordinary Germans. Your neighbor, with whom you casually drink schnapps every Wednesday, had a dark past, but seemed like a decent man. And then it turns out he sent thousands of innocent people to their deaths. The trial, later called the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, involved about 1,000 SS members. Almost all received sentences, often life imprisonment. The trials lasted 5 years, concluding in 1968 at the height of student protests across Europe. Young people followed the proceedings closely, astonished, not from fear, but from righteous anger, which, in some, even turned to terrorism. Bauer died just a month after the trials ended, having accomplished his mission and shaken German society. His work was continued by his old friend, anti-fascist and socialist Willy Brandt, whose party won the federal elections the following year. The Social Democrats captured almost 43% of the nationwide vote, and among voters under 30, over half. The youth of West Germany were fiercely leftist and anti-fascist. A year later, Brandt knelt before the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto, symbolically fulfilling his electorate's demand to confront the past. Not all ordinary Germans approved of this stance. This was a time of terrorist acts, anger, and societal splits, a period captured in the film Germany in Autumn, parts of which were directed by the renowned filmmaker Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who was born in May 1945, during the 2-week period when Germany lacked any authority. Fassbinder vividly represents the generation overwhelmed by silence. In his segment, he even filmed conversations with his mother in their kitchen. She had never supported the Nazis, but valued order and lawfulness. Ordnung. Fassbinder's approach provoked his mother, exploring guilt, accountability, and the tension between personal conscience and societal history. An authoritarian yet morally upright ruler might seem ideal in hindsight. But what about processing guilt and repentance? Many Germans who lived through the Third Reich simply wanted to be left alone. When faced with critical choices, admit, flee, adapt, or hide, they acted on the simplest goal: survival. Processing guilt became the task of subsequent generations, guided by different moral compasses and emotional experiences concerning the Nazi regime, led by dedicated anti-fascists. Trauma ran even deeper in East Germany. Researchers note that probing historical wounds in the former GDR often met with defensiveness. For example, in 1999, it was revealed that a GDR doctor of Eastern roots, Yusuf Ibrahim, had been involved in Nazi euthanasia programs. The scandal was downplayed with the argument, "Why dig up the past?" In the 21st century, however, revisiting the past is common worldwide, helping societies distinguish causes from consequences, plan for the future, and understand collective identity. In February of this year, civic activists requested that Argentine President Javier Milei release the remaining documents on the rat lines Nazis used to flee to Latin America. He agreed quickly, and by April, the files were online at Argentina's National Archive. There was no sensational revelation. Anyone can visit Buenos Aires and access the original papers. But the gesture was symbolic and telling. The number of surviving Nazis roaming the globe today is uncertain, likely in the hundreds, possibly dozens. 5 years ago, Germany's Federal Archives reported that only a handful of perpetrators could still face justice. News of centenarian concentration camp guards receiving real prison sentences is becoming increasingly rare. There are simply too few left to hide, negotiate, or remain silent. It is important to understand that the German reaction to their defeat in the war was highly varied. The fate of the descendants of key Third Reich officials illustrates this perfectly. Here are the last 2 stories for today. The daughter of SS, Chief Heinrich Himmler, spent her entire life believing that her father had been falsely accused. She actively engaged with neo-Nazi groups and at one point even worked as a secretary in the BND, under a pseudonym, of course. Meanwhile, Reinhard Gehlen, head of intelligence, knew exactly who was serving him coffee. In contrast, Martin Bormann's eldest son, whose father was Himmler's rival in the internal power struggles, repented after the war and became a priest. In his later years, he helped establish psychotherapeutic groups for victims of the Nazis and regularly traveled to Israel to give lectures. Martin Bormann Jr. passed away in 2013, while Gudrun Himmler died in 2018. A new generation, grandchildren, is now stepping into the picture, and the disagreements persist. Remember Josef Semeny, a minor Nazi, who honestly admitted he had been a member of the NSDAP, and as a result, received a wolf ticket? Well, his grandson is Friedrich Merz, a politician who recently became Germany's new chancellor. Merz belongs to the Christian Democrats, a party that grew out of the former Catholic Center Party, which once included Semeny until the Nazis banned it. The circle has closed. To conclude today's episode, consider this. In 1948, American political scientist John Hertz published an article with a striking headline, "The Fiasco of Denazification." Hertz observed that the Allies didn't denazify all of Germany. They targeted only former Nazis. Those individuals quickly received amnesty, bounced back, and began re-Nazifying Germany in ways that once again set East and West on a collision course. Later, Hertz would accurately predict the arms race between the USSR and the USA, but he misjudged Germany. Although denazification failed in practice and was rapidly abandoned, there is one factor stronger than any temporary political decision, stronger than even the most sinister criminals of the past, something that no one has ever been able to resist: time itself. And even the cleverest, most cunning, and most resourceful individuals, those who could negotiate with anyone, could not bend or bargain with time.